welcome everybody to this webinar. My name's Oliver Hill. I'm the head of apprenticeships at Dynamic Training, who are funded by the Education Training Foundation to deliver this program, as well as a plethora of other program support available to yourselves in terms of setting up accessible apprenticeship programs. I'd like to introduce Jonathan Smith. Jonathan, do you want to introduce yourself? It's probably easiest.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Oliver, for your time, and thank you everyone for coming. I know usually when these webinars happen at lunchtime, everyone almost has to change things around. So we definitely appreciate your time. So first of all, big thank you to Dynamic and the Education Training Foundation for running these workshops. This is obviously the first of 4 workshops. Workshop 2, just to do an early plug, is around exploring your apprenticeship landscape and stakeholder engagement. Workshop 3 is about learning and almost executing an accessible apprenticeship pilot, which I recommend. And then workshop 4 will be around strategies for widening employer engagement post-pilot, in other words, kind of evolving it. So I think just to touch on a couple of things. First, it's lovely to see some familiar faces. Always makes a big difference when presenting. But generally a bit of a context as to why we agreed with Dynamic and Education Training Foundation to run these programs was mainly around awareness and consistency of information. And I think that's one of the biggest frustrations I have through a number of events that I've done within the local authority, through parents, through employers, through training providers. That lack of awareness is somewhat fragmented at best. So, and also the other reason is the amount of interest we've had from local authorities to run something quite specific around accessible apprenticeships, and that what next, how do I get involved in that conversation? So they're the 2 main reasons. A little bit about me for those that aren't aware. I always think it's quite nice to just set the scene in terms of my kind of background, really. So I started within supported employment back in 2010. Seems a long time ago now. And I was probably back then placing around 12 people into supported employment per year. Very stereotypical sectors were coming out then in terms of what young people were moving into. And I absolutely loved that work, but it made me realise that actually careers was really important in terms of the development of people's aspirations for what they want to do, not what they're told what to do, but what they want to do as a future career. So I went off to, lucky enough to get a role within the local authority, and it was very much a careers role. Almost joined last bits of Connections, for those that remember Connections, and then came into what I call a NEAT role, and not an employment education training role. Very much careers advice to a range of young people, from ex-offenders through SEND, through mental health, through obviously just generalised NEAT young people that were looking at those kind of next steps. Then through restructures, and anyone who's worked in a local authority, they're quite familiar with the word restructure. I was given the opportunity to come into a very specific role, but was around focusing on pathways to employment for young people with SEND. And it was really, it really caught my attention, the role, because the amount of conversations I had with parents and generally young people about that kind of cliff edge feeling when they finish education as to what next, whether the careers guidance wasn't there, whether they weren't aware of what pathway was there, or provision that was there. So I really wanted to come into this space, and I was given a very specific role when I came in, which was very much to look at accessibility within apprenticeships. And this generally came from the Maynard report, for those that have read that back in, I think it's 2016, Oliver, if I've got that right. And it generally talks about accessibility within apprenticeships, and there was interest in it, but no one really knew where this was going to go. So it's definitely worth a read. But I'm very lucky to be able to not only be able to explore accessibility within apprenticeships, but actually be able to allow that pathway to happen for our SEND learners. Okay, So just to recap on the aims and objectives of today's workshop. So providing an overview of accessibility within apprenticeships and the benefits of this pathway, okay, which probably we could talk about even over an hour. Some of the objectives: defining what makes an apprenticeship accessible, which will be of interest to a number of you, recognising some of those available adjustments, not just through the training provider, but also adjustments within the workplace through access to work, etc. Identifying benefits to businesses, okay, and there's a number of benefits to some of these businesses that are almost having to come into this space, which is fantastic, based on the fact that I think by 2030, 30% of our workforce is due to be neurodiverse. Okay, so businesses are going to have to start coming into this space to not only look at apprenticeships as a viable pathway, but also this talent pool that's available. And also, lastly, but not forgetting, sharing good practice from a local authority perspective. Next slide, please. Okay, so what I wanted to do, I read a really good book called The Neurodiverse Workplace, which again I will plug or recommend. It's a really good read. But what I'd like everyone to do is just close your eyes and listen while I read out this analogy, because I think it's really apt to the work that is done with young people generally. So I'm just going to read it out to you, and then I'm going to summarise kind of my thoughts regarding it. So different flowers need different conditions to thrive and flourish. Some need a sunny position, others do best in the shade. Some need regular watering, others survive with very little water. Some grow very quickly, others take their time to flower. Seeds will not grow and thrive if the environment is wrong. And when I read that, it really made me think actually to some of the work that we do, that people need support, people need to make sure the environment's right. You know, what support does my manager need to give me? And we need to be upfront and honest about what that support looks like. So I ask you all to think about some of the support that you may have within your role. It could be working hours, it could be working patterns, it could be assistive technology. But ultimately, we all need support to a point. In terms of some of the adjustments that I have within my work, okay, I'm colourblind, okay, which generally causes me a nightmare in the morning when I dress myself. But generally also, my team need to be aware of that through some of the presentations and some of the data and how I interpret that data, okay. Also, I have a condensed working week. So I do Monday to Thursday, okay. Still work my full working hours, but I condense it because it works for my two young children, more financially as well. But we won't go down there. But what I'm saying is those adjustments really benefit me in the workplace. And I think through that analogy, generally, it's really important to say that to get the best version of the individual can only happen with the greater understanding of how best we support them in the workplace. And this is about talent. How can we allow that talent to shine? Okay, so obviously in terms of the work we've done around accessible apprenticeships, there is probably a little bit of confusion up and down the country. I've heard the term supported apprenticeships, accessible apprenticeships, and even inclusive apprenticeships. So generally what we're saying is all apprenticeships should be accessible, okay? The new guidance that comes in that I will talk about as we go through the presentation really promotes that accessibility around apprenticeships moving forward. But I just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page, that actually there is different terminology, but ultimately the main goal is that all apprenticeships should be accessible. Okay, so in terms of what are accessible apprenticeships, okay, I'll read this and I'll give you some a bit more context. So accessible apprenticeships are traditional apprenticeships, but with flexibilities for both the business and the learner. Really important that we state for the business as well, and I'll touch on that as we go through the slides. These programs are tailored to support individuals who face employment barriers, including those with physical disabilities, neurodivergence, learning disabilities, and autism. Accessible apprenticeships are apprenticeships that take into take into consideration the individual needs of the learner, allowing them to get the best out of their apprenticeship journey. So what I want to do very quickly on this slide is just touch on those flexibilities. Okay, there's some new guidance that's come out from August, but most of the work that we've been doing up until very recently is that flexibility around those with an education, health and care plan, both current or historic. That's the key bit, current or historic. So it could be for 16-year-olds, but it could have been people that have had an education, health and care plan, but it's been ceased. And that's really important to stipulate. So it means that anyone with an education, health and care plan can come in at a reduced level. The actual guidance states that they need to achieve entry level 3 by the end of their apprenticeship. Okay, what we do within the local authority, because we do a lot of work around supported internships, we say that generally our expectation is they come in at entry level 3, because what that does is takes the pressure off an apprentice. Okay, instead of thinking, well, I've got the employment, the training, and I've got to make sure I get to entry level 3. So they can come in below, but what we do as a local authority is we state that they have to come in at entry level 3. Okay, to start with. In terms of a business, and I think it's really important that we state how this can benefit a business as well as the individual. There is a huge untapped talent pool that businesses aren't aware of, and that we need to make sure that both businesses are aware, okay, of this talent pool that is available, especially in light of some of the skill shortages that we're facing. I think within Essex, I think 2 out of 3 employers are all stating that they've got skill shortages across a number of industries. So actually, we should be allowing this pipeline to come through and upskill those employers. In terms of another flexibility, we do a lot of work around the adjustment of hours of an apprenticeship. Okay, and historically, 2 reasons why our SEN cohort didn't think apprenticeships was a viable pathway is because generally the conversation was around you've got to be at level 2 for maths and English, and the other would be that apprenticeships are full-time. Okay, we use the adjustment, and it's not just specific for accessible apprenticeships, but we use the adjustment in terms of the hours, as long as the training provider and the employer are happy. Okay, of which I've never really had an issue. But we normally look at the apprenticeships around 20-25 hours. I think if you reduce it any more than that, then what generally happens is the apprenticeship just goes on and on and on, and you will struggle with the engagement from all parties. Okay, but that reduction in hours really allows those individuals to come into this space where they would generally think that full-time might be a stretch too far. And that's not for all. But it's there if we need to use that adjustment. And I think the last flexibility is very much around endpoint assessment. Okay, and we're doing a huge amount of work at the moment in terms of with our training providers to get the endpoint assessment organisations and to understand what adjustments need to be put into place to give that young person the best possible chance of getting through their EPA. And I think that's working out really well at the moment. There's still a bit of work to do in that space, but generally what you're doing is, or what we're doing is providing the information to those EPAOs about the understanding of the individual and what adjustments they may need. And if that's done as early in the piece as possible, then everything can be ready for that EPA. I think one of the things as well is if you look at the actual success rates of apprenticeships, it's pretty low. And I think a lot of that is generally around, are we making sure those adjustments are in place for the learner? And I think if they're not, I think that could be contributing to the low 54% at the moment success rate. Just one of the questions came in, EPA, sorry, endpoint assessment, sorry. And with any apprenticeship, they've got to go through an endpoint assessment to show competency at the end of the qualification. Next slide, please, Oliver. Okay, So obviously the work that we've been doing around accessible apprenticeships within the local authority has mainly been for those learners with an education, health and care plan, current or historic. But this new guidance has come out since August. And if I read it to you, it really does open up the work that we're trying to do. Where an apprentice has a learning difficulty or disability, regardless of whether they have been issued with an education, health and care plan or equivalent, which is a barrier to them achieving the English or maths requirement, providers should consider whether they should be offered a flexibility to achieve entry level 3 functional skills in the adjusted subjects. So what this means ultimately is one of the biggest challenges that I had when I was speaking to parents, young people, practitioners, was that a number of people were coming through that were kind of in that grey area, that probably should have had a statement, didn't have a statement. And this new guidance, which has come about through a pilot that was done, and Dynamic were part of that pilot, along with a number of other training providers, where they looked at individuals that didn't have the education, health and care plan, okay, that needed the adjustment. It was a really successful pilot. So I'm really pleased to see this guidance now has been implemented, not just for those with an education, health and care plan, but for those that actually may need that adjustment, but they will need to show evidence of that. And I don't know, maybe at the end, Oliver can explain a little bit more about maybe what some of those, what some of that evidence looks like, because this is still quite a new piece of guidance that's come in. And I think the main conversation is around what does that evidence look like for those that may not have an education, health and care plan. I think the last point to note on this as well is that this shows that we need to have a very robust screening process. Okay, so when young people are going into training providers, and it's in the guidance as well, that they have to do a thorough, robust screening process now to identify those needs, those adjustments. So I think there's a big conversation here around how we support training providers to really give them the information they need to make their life a little bit easier in this space as well. Okay, next slide, Oliver. Okay, so this visual that I put together is a model of what I see as engagement activities that employers and education could look at adopting. So within our local authority, just to give an example, we do a lot of work with our SEND schools around vocational profiling. Okay, and vocational profiling, for those that aren't aware, is very much a kind of conversation with a young person as to their aspirations, as to their support needs, as to you know, what pathway might be best suited for you on your journey. And careers leaders can come into this conversation and really support specific careers work. So what we're looking at with the vocational profiling is really an understanding of the individual, okay, showcasing some of the pathways that are available, but also what do you need to get where you want to go. So vocational profiling is working within our 31 SEND schools through our local authority. And what I want to do is really highlight how businesses and education should be working a little bit closer. So through businesses, we're doing a piece of work at the moment is really looking at that engagement with businesses in the local community, how they engage with their local school or SEND school. We're looking at maybe a school visit, okay, just to almost get an understanding of the various levels of capabilities within that school, but also talent that's in that school that could feed into that employer's talent pipeline. That could lead into a business visit, okay, where young people that have got a real clear aspiration can go on a visit to really understand what the world of work looks like within their aspiration. Work taster days, businesses could look at going into schools and helping with interview skills, employability skills, which we know we're really looking at. I think also we've got work experience, and that's something we really need to be pushing through as much as we can, because work experience gives young people that we work with so many skills, and also gets them to be quite clear about their aspirations. Is it what I thought it was going to be like? That conversation then, while you're building the business up into this space, can then start leading into pathways. Okay, where businesses are going, okay, what is a supported internship, or what is an accessible apprenticeship? And the model is building it up where where employers have a little bit more confidence in what we're trying to achieve, but with the same outcome that we want, which is more opportunities towards those pathways. So I think just a couple of things to add to this slide. This is about creating awareness around pathways and bringing that relationship between education and business closer. To give you an idea, there was some data that came out last week, and it was ultimately looking at send young people going into levels 1, level 2 and level 3 courses, vocational courses. And the actual success rates of those individual post education going into employment was around 5%. That's a scary statistic. Whereas if you look at what's happening with apprenticeships, generally in our area, local authority in Essex, okay, we're looking at apprenticeships as a national at the moment that showcase they've got a learning disability or a learning disability or difficulty, is around 26%. The work we're doing around accessible apprenticeships at the moment is around 60%. So you can see the varying differences from vocational courses to people going to more employment pathways such as supported internships and accessible apprenticeships. So whilst I'm not saying obviously don't go into those vocational courses, but the statistics really showcase that supported internships and accessible apprenticeships do have a greater employment outcome generally. And also I think when we talk generally around going back to apprenticeships, you've got a conversation here with businesses that whenever I speak to people, we always promote supported employment. And it's absolutely a pathway that should be discussed and promoted. But if we don't take businesses on that journey, the conversation we generally start having with businesses is, are you willing to pay £11.44 an hour for a 21 or 21-year-old plus individual compared to potentially £6.40 an hour for an apprenticeship? And there isn't a right or wrong answer to that. But what we do is we usually get punched so high towards supported employment. But what we need to do is grow the businesses into this space. And I think by growing the business into this space, they then have a choice of which pathway works for that business. So I think there's a value in absolutely both of these pathways and supported employment, but it's about how we bring businesses onto that journey and let them choose which pathway works for them. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is a very clear slide. Okay, but what we're pretty much saying around apprenticeships is there's 3 key players, and all parties are linked when we talk about apprenticeships. So if we talk right at the top of the triangle, individuals. Within Essex, we have 14,000 individuals that are on education, health and care plans at varying stages of their education, but 14,000 is a huge number. Okay, when we talk about apprenticeships, if just 1% of those individuals are ready for an apprenticeship, okay, then we're looking at 140 apprenticeship opportunities to be created. And I think that really kind of sums up where I see it. We've got to make sure that, yes, we've got a huge number of people on education, health and care plans, but how are we transitioning these individuals onto pathways would be my question. In terms of employers, we have a huge amount of employers within any local authority, stakeholders that we work with. We've got social value. We've got anchors, okay? We've got careers enterprise companies that work with a number of employers. We have local skills improvement partnerships. We have CELEP. We have a number of enterprises that we work with in terms of that can create opportunities within our own organisations. So actually, for me, the local authority needs to show the way, and then others will come into this space. Okay. And last but least, training providers. There's a number of training provider networks up and down the country. To name a few, we've got the Western Training Provider Network, which is a really good training provider network that I've had contacts with. In Essex, we've got the Essex Provider Network, got the main Greater Manchester Learning Provider Network. What we have to do is constructively challenge to make sure that actually this guidance is out there and people are aware of the guidance through our training providers. This is about awareness and consistency of information. And it relates very, very briefly to a conversation I had yesterday with a parent who said, okay, I'm interested in accessible apprenticeships, and they were in a different part of Essex. And they said, well, what training providers offer this? How do I know what training provider offers this, and how do I know what doesn't? And we need to not only drive this message through the training providers, but I would love to start seeing consistency on websites and platforms to say, for those individuals that do have an education, health and care plan, or who may need an adjustment, we can support you. And also what that journey looks like for the individual, because the amount of parents that come through where there's that lack of consistency, it needs to change. Okay, next slide. Okay, so if I haven't already convinced you, hopefully I have, the same code of practice states that all children and young people are entitled to an appropriate education. It also focuses on post-16 and post-18 pathways, and it's a key part of the preparing for adulthood agenda. So a couple other points on this slide. If you look at that 5.1% of individuals will learn to be undertaking level 1 or 2 we talked about. But that's a scary statistic. But what it shows to me is that we've got qualifications, but when they come to the end of those qualifications, how are we taking them on that journey? Who's giving that careers advice? Who's allowing for that transition onto the appropriate next step, whether that's employment, apprenticeships, etc. The increase in education, health and care plans, which will be known to local authority, it's a very topical conversation, but we're looking at generally just under a 5% increase year on year of the number of education, health and care plans. That's a scary statistic as well. But what it means is that we have to avoid a bottleneck, we have to start looking at what pathways to employment are available for young people. And as a massive ambassador for this pathway, we need to be looking at how we can allow those individuals that are ready for an apprenticeship to come into this space. We also touched on this 30%. And the reason we need to be exploring this pathway is because generally by 2030, 30% is going to be neurodiverse. Businesses need to come into this space. They need to be clear about the funding, the awareness, how they can best support individuals, but also training providers need to come into this space. Education needs to come into this space. We talk a little bit about progressive pathways that align to supported internships and supported employment. For me, accessible apprenticeships is probably the last carriage of the train, because supported employment is a fantastic pathway, but there are a number of people within supported employment that also may be doing enough hours within a supported employment model to actually maybe go on to an accessible apprenticeship. Are we giving them the opportunity to do that? Because by having that competency of having a qualification, the retention or the fact that a young person has ownership of where they want to go with that career when they've got this qualification, I think is really empowering for a young person. And obviously social care savings, the reliance on some of the system in terms of the costs, we need to be pushing this pathway. And I think a number of those points hopefully alludes to why we should be doing it. I think just the last thing, Oliver, before we move on to the next slide, I think having looked on the DfE, I think at the moment there's about 576,000 children and young people with education, health and care plans in the country. Again, there's our target audience. Okay, 576,000, and that's going to be growing 5% year on year. So there's from a business perspective, there's your target audience. Okay, and businesses need to come into that space to actually think, wow, how can we work with the local authority to create opportunities and help some of the skill shortages that we've got. Okay, next slide, Oliver. Okay, so identifying some of the benefits to businesses. There is some funding for businesses, but I really want to concentrate on generally some of the advantages of our SEN cohort that is so talented coming into this space. So I think the top one, fresh perspectives, new ideas and potential customers. Statistics say that actually by businesses hiring disabled talent almost opens up a completely different customer base. Okay, and that can help obviously businesses in terms of revenue. In terms of creativity, innovation, some of our young people are absolutely fantastic. We've done some fantastic standards, apprenticeship standards within Essex, where creativity, innovation has really come to the fore. And I'll give an example. We've got we had a young person that's doing a personal trainer standard, and he's working at a place called Therapy Gyms, and he came in and started bringing his complete customer base of talent to that gym. Okay, and the business couldn't almost cope with the demand just from employing him as a disabled individual working within personal training, and all of a sudden this great big flow of individuals came through that actually were starting to use the gym based on one person being employed. And it was a fantastic story in terms of how it worked out. We've talked about talent pool, the skill shortages, but also some of these unique skills and strengths. And there's a good example there around accounting and that kind of analytical thinking, and how that brain processes. So a couple of other things. What I want to do is just give an example for businesses, and it's a personal example. So my son is ADHD, and he's only 8, bless him, but he really, really enjoys Lego. Okay, and he would spend all day playing with Lego if he could. Okay, but from an example to a business, I'm already starting thinking about manual dexterity. I'm starting to think about his mechanical ability, his persistence and patience, his problem solving. And that's me as a dad. But if we can start matching my son in this case to a business, he will be fantastic in a specific role. But this is about matching and making sure that we understand what the businesses want, but we also understand what the young people's skill set is and talent. And I think it's a really good example to show that actually, if you get the matching right to businesses, then businesses will come into this space. And I think generally, there's a number of different benefits to businesses, but I do feel that, again, it's about taking businesses on that journey, the exposure to young people, and making them realise there is a huge talent pool here, but we've got to match. We've got to match people. Okay, next slide. Okay, so identifying benefits to the individuals. This is a pretty simple slide, but it's generally we know what the advantages are in terms of going on to an apprenticeship pathway, but this sense of identity, self-worth and personal fulfillment. The amount of conversations I've had with young people where they say, I just want to work. I'm capable, I have aspirations to do this, I just want to work. This is around social inclusion, this is around financial independence, and health comes into that as well. The amount of services that are probably snowed under at the moment because of people not actually being in employment. Okay, and actually they should be in employment. And if this pathway can be opened up to allow that to happen, then that's fantastic. Obviously, this is around relief on other services as well, which I just mentioned there. There's a number of services where people are reliant on, but actually employment, and the statistics show that once you're in employment, there's a number of other services that we're less reliant on. And that's absolutely, that from a cost perspective, but also this is about talent. And I keep saying talent because I mean it. I've seen so much talent. And if we can get these young people into employment through an apprenticeship pathway supported correctly, then the benefits to the individuals is undescribable, to be honest. Next slide. Okay, so a little bit about adjustments in terms of training provider adjustments. And obviously Dynamic do a number of these adjustments through their person-centered approach. But under the Equality Act, training providers are required to make adjustments. And there's a number of examples here about different adjustments that we can use. Okay, some of them we can use through access to work, especially around assistive technology, Dragon software, things like that can be purchased through access to work. Others can be just a very simple adjustment that can be put into place. Okay, but it's important that we understand what some of those adjustments actually look like. Also, there's some funding for training providers. Okay, so there's what's called ALS funding, which is called additional learner support funding. It means providers can draw down through evidence £150 per calendar month. There's also exceptional learner support when the costs are for more complex individuals, okay, where it exceeds 19,000 per year. So I think generally this is about a robust screening, making sure that they've got the right adjustments or the right software or digital equipment to be able to do their apprenticeship. And from a local authority perspective, we need to raise greater awareness around what possible funding is out there and what a delivery model could look like for some of those other training providers that are wanting to come into this space but may need extra support to do so. Okay, but ultimately there's a number of adjustments there through the work that we do around accessible apprenticeships. We've used a number of those adjustments, and simple adjustments make such a difference for those individuals. And I think we need to make sure people are aware of those adjustments, not just training providers, but young people. What is available for me to help me through my apprenticeship through that additional funding? Okay, next slide. Okay, so recognising available adjustments, access to work. So for those that aren't aware, access to work is ultimately, it's the best way to describe it is a bank, where you can actually support individuals with things like specialist equipment. We use it a lot for taxis. And what access to work will do is ultimately support from a financial point of view to get people either to and from work, support workers, potentially job coaches. But what they won't do is they won't give you job coaches or support workers. You have to find that, but they will give you the finances to be able to obviously make sure that adjustment is in place. We've got an example. I'll give you an example of a young man called Tom, and he did a community activator apprenticeship, which is ultimately like a sports coach apprenticeship. Tom was pretty much always told that he couldn't do an apprenticeship. And the reason for that was because he was epileptic, and people were very concerned about when he would have his epileptic fits or seizures. So he came through to us. He had an employer that was really interested in him. And a lot of the work we did, the employer said, I'm not worried about the seizures, I'm here about the talent. You know, he knew Tom as a previous employee. And he said, I really want to move him on to an apprenticeship. How can we make this happen? So we approached access to work, and through his epilepsy, because he couldn't travel through public transport, we looked at obviously allowing him to get taxis to and from work. Access to work paid for that. But what we also realised was an issue is if he did have a seizure in the taxis, we would need someone to go with him. So Access to Work also paid for a support worker to go with him on the taxis to and from work. Okay, to give you an idea for this individual that was told pretty much he couldn't go out to work because of his epilepsy. Okay, I think Access to Work, it was around £22,000 over 3 years they paid out. Okay, for him to go and do his apprenticeship. Okay, but for him to go out, do his apprenticeship, I think he's now got a community activator level 2 qualification, and he's now working. He's now employed now. He's completed his apprenticeship. He's now employed as a young man who was told that he couldn't go out to work. And Access to Work allowed that to happen. Okay, so it's really just an acknowledgement of Access to Work is out there. Do employers know enough about Access to Work? Do training providers know enough about Access to Work? And also, do parents know enough about Access to Work and their siblings? Because it really can be, it's called the hidden secret almost, but it's out there and we really utilise it to its benefit. So it's just something for you to be aware of. Next slide, please. Well, I think we've got a video next, Oliver, haven't we?
We have indeed. I'm just going to stop sharing on the share to make sure I've got the sound on, because that's a schoolboy error I always do. Please, somebody thumbs up me if you can hear the sound. Here we go.
I'm Daisy. I'm a fundraiser and events officer. I'm doing the fundraising apprenticeship with JGA, which I got through Essex County Council and Targeted Employment. I work for a charity called Abberton Rural Training. We help vulnerable and isolated people in Essex get back into education, qualifications, we get them get jobs, volunteering. I wanted to expand my knowledge and just get back into learning because I really enjoyed uni. The apprenticeship's been really helpful, helping me achieve my role here. I mainly write bids and grants to raise money for the charity. I'll have weekly meetings with the CEO, my line manager. They're very flexible within my role. I can work from home and in the office, which suits my accessibility needs. My most proud achievement would be that I've managed to raise £80,000 for the charity in the year that I've been here through bids, grants, fundraising activities. I have monthly bike events that I run and attend, which I go to the Colchester site in Wormingford. I like being able to help people and seeing the good that we do as a charity.
I'm Erin Lysandro and I'm the office manager for Abberton Rural Training. Daisy's fantastic. I'm most proud about her personal development. Her confidence has grown. She's had really good support through her tutors and mentors that she's had from the apprenticeship side.
My name's Jonathan Smith. I work for Essex County Council and I'm the lead for inclusion around apprenticeships. Apprenticeships can be a really viable pathway for young people with disabilities and difficulties.
The adaptations have been quite easy and something that we've always encouraged for all our staff.
Through Access to Work, I got a program called Dragon, which is a voice dictation app and headset. If I want to walk around and write the bids, I just talk through the headset. I don't have to be stuck at the desk, and that's been really helpful. I actually get a taxi through Access to Work. The hour-and-a-half bus journey just wasn't feasible for me and my disability. They've been very helpful in helping me access work.
It's been a really seamless process. Having the Access to Work programme and being able to order all the equipment she needs, a home office space has been fantastic. It's just watching her fly, I guess, taking her from the Daisy she was a year ago to the Daisy she is now.
My advice would be to not give up. There are many options out there to help you get to work or get an apprenticeship. It exceeded my expectations and it has been a great thing to do, and I really don't regret it, and I would encourage everyone to have a think about it and do one if you want to.
Lovely. Thanks, Oliver. So ultimately, Daisy has recently passed her fundraising apprenticeship, and I think that the main point from that video, which was a fantastic video, the cost of her apprenticeship was probably about 16,000 for the business, but she's already brought in £80,000 worth of funding as part of her role. And I just think it goes to show that actually, because she was matched, she always wanted to do this kind of funding, events management. It goes to show that match has worked really well for the business and the learner. And because of her cerebral palsy, those adjustments mainly around getting to and from work were a huge challenge for Daisy. So access to work was actually pivotal in allowing her to go on to her apprenticeship. And funny enough, she rang me about an hour ago, and she's been offered 2 or 3 other roles, of which she's weighing up now, which is absolutely fantastic. And her career now, she has the confidence now to go and actually explore those other opportunities based on that fantastic qualification she achieved. So ultimately, I think that's it in terms of the presentation.